time in this place. When you sang, you could feel it close, in buildings made out of stones and ghosts. You told me just to keep this a secret, a word that turns into dust when you speak it. You write about a spirit in your stories, came down to tell another story, and now we build our cities higher than the heavens, and tell the world to watch what happens. Break into cracks all the smooth surfaces and make sense of our time in this place.
Hi, I'm Donna Livingston. I'm the CEO of the White Museum of the Canadian Rockies, and we're delighted to welcome you to get up close and personal, digitally at least, with our new exhibition of Michael Corner's work. So we're going to discuss that in a moment, but I just wanted to acknowledge that we are so pleased and so grateful to be operating on the traditional lands of the Stoney Nakoda people, including the Bearspaw, Wesley, and Chiniki. It's part of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, which are part of the Dene people, and the Métis Nation of Region 3. These groups have really helped us understand the land and the importance of culture here, and what a healing power it is to come to the mountains, as we all know. We're very excited with this new digital initiative that we launched last week, and you'll be able to access it regularly. So thank you for coming. And I just want to let you know we've got some exciting things in the works. We're closed right now, but we are going to be opening later on in the year, and you'll have access to this material digitally. But we're excited because June 13th is Catherine Robb White. She's our founder of the White Museum. It's her 150th birthday, so we're going to be celebrating that with some special events. And right now we're collecting material for a very special mountain online auction that we've been working with Doug Levis on very generously. And that's going to happen in June. So it's going to be your chance to take a little bit home of mountain culture. So welcome to the White, and thank you for tuning in. And I'll just turn it over to my colleague, and you, where are you? Come on over here. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Ewen. I'm the Chief Curator of Art and Heritage here at the White Museum. And it's so good of you to join us tonight. We will be practicing social distancing. So when Michael is talking, he will have his mask off and I will have mine on. But we will try and keep a distance so that we all stay safe. Before we get into the program, I just want to thank the technical wizardry of our team here, Sierra, Natalie Delbeck, DL Cameron, and Kayla Kays. So welcome, and here comes Michael. Michael is a self-taught practicing artist who has been working at this craft for approximately 8 years, but has really dove into the whole field of it in the last 4. No. And in talking with your wonderful dealers at the Edge Gallery, David and Kathy Foxcroft, they both acknowledge that you are a very hardworking person, and your dedication to the art has really propelled you from, a struggling starter to where you are now. So it's really wonderful. You are an avid reader, we know that. Yes. And I'm wondering if that, and David Foxcroft also mentioned your vegetarianism. This is what a vegetarian looks like, by the way.
Still alive.
So we're sort of wondering how those qualities have helped you as an artist, but also driven you to your decision to be an artist. Double barrel question.
Oh, yeah, that's a lot. I never really considered my diet and the integration of the art, but I will say I've always had an absolute affinity for animals, and there's just something so wonderfully kind about coexisting with creatures with a different intelligence. And I've always had pets, and I have an affinity with birds that I just can't express enough. And I don't know if that's related to being a vegetarian or has anything to do with it, but I certainly do enjoy those guys.
Great. So when you talk about pets, you at one point told us that you had this wonderful rat when you were a child. And
Yeah.
here, I guess, is the closest thing to that we can possibly.
I had a pet rat named Rex, and I got him because I'd injured my head, and my parents were kind enough to offer me a baby rat as a present, I suppose, for surviving that. But in living with rats, they're the most wonderful creatures, and they have little seams on their bellies, and they just seem that there's any animal in the animal kingdom that would have an occupation, rats would be tailors. So this guy hangs out with his little spool of thread, and you can just, there's just something so human about them. They can become very anthropomorphic. They almost have thumbs.
So I guess the other thing that's really fascinating about this collection here of animal portraits are sort of the way one paints a portrait of an animal versus that of a human. What are some of those challenges, or what are some of the easy points of that skill?
I think the trouble with painting animals is that you always get trapped in the Disney trap. Like they can become very cute, or you lose track of them as what they are, and you want to avoid that anthropomorphism. You want to just let them exist with their own dignity, and that's what I try to do. I try to place them in a space that they have their own personalities and they have their own sense of being. And I fumble with it, but every now and then they stare back at me, and I think sometimes it works.
Well, I'm going to use this one as an example because the facial expression on this fellow is absolutely astounding. And sitting there holding these beads. I mean, definitely he has a personality, undeniable personality.
Yeah, it's almost an act of defiance. I mean, he's either offering or threatening. And raccoons, they have that about them. They're an animal that they have their own dignity. They hold their own. I think whatever he's doing with those beats, I'm interested.
Can you speak to us about the painterly quality? Because you're picking up these lovely colors in here that also are found on his body and then sort of very gently placed in there, deeply placed into the background. Can you talk about that?
I developed fascinations with things, and I had a bit of a love affair with beets at one point. I think they're one of the most personable of vegetables, and you just look for excuses to paint them. The raccoon seemed like, as another personal animal, you should coexist with them. As to the painting, it's a lot of there's a lot of razor work with a knife blade in there. There was impasto passages, and it was just kind of integrating the background into the foreground and creating a whole out of something that had a lot of different elements going on. I was also absolutely obsessed with fur, so that's another motivation to paint such creatures like those.
And you can see the richness in the fur when you look at the goat as well.
That goat, Alistair, who lives in an animal rescue sanctuary called the Alice Sanctuary, he's the most wonderful creature you could imagine. I hung out with that guy for a day. He just followed me around, and I've never wanted to take something home with me so badly, but we got in a lot of trouble for getting a dog, and I didn't think our landlords would be okay with having a goat. So I left him behind, but man, that's the best I could do to share with the world what an incredible creature Alistair was.
And then moving down the wall, as you can see, viewers, as we're moving down the wall, these absolutely beautiful frames. And you got these at Edge Gallery?
Yeah, Dave and Kathy did all the framing for this, and it's absolutely remarkable. I really like gilded frames, and they've gone above and beyond in getting these guys surrounded in the manner they deserve to be surrounded. It's really quite something.
Excellent. So here's one of your birds. Talk to me about him.
This was,
her.
well, I mean, the lowly seagull, but that's an animal that, I think they're absolutely magnificent. And that guy was on a beach in Ontario and kind of, up to doing what seagulls do. And eventually I decided I absolutely needed to paint him. And that's the result of it. He's living with 3 tomatoes. And I don't know, they seem like something that seagulls would be into.
So when you've been studying both portraiture and landscape, I assume you've been referencing historic artists, art history books, etc.
Yes.
To help with this style. Have you ever gotten into any of the Audubon books or any of that kind of thing?
No.
Okay.
No. Most of these, with their kind of stark backgrounds, I mean, it's kind of looking at the Velázquez, then the Manet transition into figures in a void and in a space.
Right.
And when I'm painting these, a lot of the time it is a question of space, and I'm trying to reach around the form and feel the presence of something that exists in more than it's not an issue of trying to make something into 3 dimensions. It's trying to feel the other side of a form. So I'm actively aware of everything you can't see, and I'm trying to make that perceptible to the viewer.
And so while you're watching the seagull, I'm assuming you're madly sketching away and capturing photographic images as well, or?
I absolutely sketch as much as is humanly possible. When it comes to colors and things, and especially when you're putting these things in the studio, I will use photo references just for a sense of texture and feel. The trouble with photographs is they are as 2-dimensional as anything can possibly be. And sometimes when you work from photos, you just find yourself replicating photos, and you end up with a facsimile, and it isn't what I'm aiming for. It's a good reference point, but you have to do things to work outside of it. So these animals, just to keep myself working, I painted them all with my left hand because it made me more conscious of what I would have to observe versus what was obviously there. So they came about, I guess I painted them backwards in a sense. It made me focus more on the idea of what something was rather than just the stark image of it. So that was an interesting project.
So you've moved between right and left hand?
No, just these animals.
Oh, okay.
These are all left-handed animals, and then I just never did it again. It was just this brief moment of madness. I don't know what came over me, and every now and then, if I'm actually painting portraits or doing, a lot of the times things on the left side of the frame, I'll instinctively start to use my left hand for, but not to the extent that these are just entirely built that way. So, and that helps you break away from the reliance on the photographic image. It makes you ask different questions about what you're seeing.
Okay, excellent. So we'll go to the goat. He's another one of the Alice Sanctuary animals in Northeast Calgary.
Yes, or it's northeast of Calgary.
Northeast of Calgary.
A farm out there.
Right.
Well, I mean, my goodness, who wouldn't want to spend time with that goat and his apple? I mean, it was that. I don't really have a lot to say about the Alice Sanctuary animals beyond, it was just such an honor to be able to hang out in a place where everything just lived its own life, and it wasn't, it was just really beautiful. And everything I painted that came out of that was, I just did my best to convey the dignity that those animals had.
I think you've done a really good job. I remember you once talking about his hooves.
Oh, yeah, he had the most ridiculous toenails, and I've undersold them. But he had them in trim for a while, so these things actually curled out onto the ground. They looked somewhat contrived when I put them in the painting, so I did a little, I trimmed them on my own, but he had the most magnificent toenails.
Well, he's got a lovely disposition to him. His face is wonderful.
I was really fond of it.
And again, you've captured the fur beautifully.
Oh, thank you.
A very challenging thing to have to capture. It's almost as hard to capture fur as it is water.
I think I have nightmares about painting things that are almost white.
Fair enough.
It's just, it can get so dry and so stark so quickly. So it's, that's a very challenging thing for me to deal with anything that's white. So that was a frustrating painting for sure.
Well, you've done it well. So let's move down the wall a bit and move into another form of painting, which is still life. And very different from your portraits, but there are elements of the still life that seem to have moved from your animals into that. You're using fruit.
I was just saying earlier, that's the only way I peel lemons now. That's my existence with lemons, is to curl them up like that. And I'm fascinated with still lives and dead objects, because it allows you to become, you just develop strange obsessions. I had a fabric painting phase I went through where all I wanted to do was to paint fabric. So I just looked for any excuse to do it. And fruit, sometimes it rots, it's sitting there, all these flowers are long dead. I think that's why that rose ended up there. It's a painting from quite some time ago. But it's just, painting ultimately, I think, forces you to challenge the way you see the world. Because nothing's really given the way you think it is. You sit down to paint an apple and you think you know what that looks like, and you absolutely don't. And when you put a brush or a pencil in your hand, you're forced to start looking at things, and things that you've never really paid attention to before become very, very salient. They're there for you. And I think ultimately what motivated me to start painting was that realization that with a brush or a pencil, you stop and see the world again. And it's a world that you've seen your whole life, but you've never really noticed. So something as simple as a few pieces of fruit in a bottle, you're hypnotized by it because you don't know your way around it. And it's incredibly elusive and it makes no sense, and you can't actually depict what you think it is, because what you think it is isn't what's before your eyes. And still lives, they appear to be somewhat mundane, but are some of the most challenging things to paint because everything's loaded with pre-expectations. And to work through that is a very challenging process. This still life was done during the first lockdown, when you were trapped and you had no subjects. And I just went through a phase where I was trying to paint as much as possible that was inside, and it was, it continues. I'll never not paint still lives, because I honestly believe there's nothing more challenging to it than that. So that's where they came from.
Well, that was going to be my next question. How has COVID impacted your artistic practice?
It's an absolute mixed blessing. It's wonderful that we're all in the same boat, in that sense that no one can do anything. I mean, I've been preparing for this for 6 years since I started painting. So yeah, I'm pretty well equipped, but the isolation, you can't work with people directly and you can't interact with things the same way, is a bit of a challenge, but it forces you to pay attention to different things that maybe didn't interest you in the same way before. You become very intimately acquainted with your prison space, and I certainly have done that. But I'm not sure. It's an odd thing. I'm not so as happy about it now as I was when it first happened. I think it feels like it's been going on for a long time. And
it has been.
So it's getting a little bit more challenging, but it's still, for me, all I want to do is paint, so nothing's really changed. There's always things to paint.
Excellent, excellent. They're lovely. The challenge of making fruit look round and solid and firm and lush on a flat surface, you've done it very well. It's hard to do.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's I'll be struggling with that for the next 50 years if I'm lucky.
Good. That's good. All right, let's move over here. So this is a really, really interesting series. Very, very different from what we've just looked at, and sort of relates to a series we're going to be looking at a little later. But you mentioned that you used a spatula to paint a lot of this.
I absolutely did. I acquired I guess you could just call it a rubber scraper, and it was the most fascinating tool to work with. So I found myself digging into backgrounds and moving paint in a manner that I just hadn't done before. So it started out with just an experiment to see what you could do with a new tool, and then it expanded into just creating absolute voids around figures chromatically. So essentially, these all started out as very, very, very colorful paintings, and I just slowly drained the life out of them until they stood in these voids. And there's remnants of it in the moons and in the, there's little cut marks throughout, but these were definitely a COVID project, as I think I started to go a little bit mad. but they were, for the most part, all done last month. So they're very fresh paintings.
We talked about this one quite a bit, didn't we? This feeling of a Garden of Eden, religious sort of, are we being expelled? It's kind of, it's very dark in a way. And maybe that is the COVID thing that's going on.
It could be. I'm not convinced that those rabbits are necessarily happy about where they've ended up. I mean, but there's the argument, perhaps the owl is just looking to greet them in a relatively friendly way. I'm not sure. It's called the night, and I see the figure, the protection of innocence perhaps creeps into it, and one way or another, but I'm not sure. It was one of those paintings that you end up in a place that you never anticipated from the outset. It ended up there over time. So yeah, it's a weird one.
I think they're really strong, and I love the fact that you've got they're hares. They are hares.
Yes,
yeah,
they're absolutely
they
hares.
are here as well, and we'll see them again, which is really interesting.
The very first animal I painted was a hare, and they've never not been in my work,
something.
I suppose. They keep popping up, which is something I've never really thought about till this moment. So yeah, I have a hare thing.
So if you were doing these in COVID time, were you using live models or?
No, these are constructions.
They're constructions.
And whether I did, I couldn't, because that would have been terribly illegal. So we'll just leave it at that. It was a lockdown, and we have
I was locked down.
Locked down. No one saw anyone. No hares hang out. There was no foxes. It was totally just me. We'll just leave it at that.
Right. Okay, well, let's move on to this next group. Again, these are Alice Sanctuary
Yes.
animals. So you've been using this green quite a bit in your canvases as we're going through the animal ones.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Huh. Yeah, that's I suppose I had a love affair with that green, and it's all of a sudden very obvious that it's absolutely everywhere. So that's the summer of that green. I don't know where it came from, but I think I really like it. It's odd. Like sometimes you're painting and you get obsessed with things. You can become obsessed with lemons the same way you can be obsessed with a particular pigment. And pigments are very challenging because you don't really know what to do with them until you experiment with them a ton. And then once you start using them more and more, they become hypnotic. Like you want to put them everywhere. And every time you get a new pigment, a new color, I usually just leave them laying around and kind of side-eye them, and eventually I work up the guts to start working them into paintings. But it's a difficult process. But when they start to work, you just want to use them everywhere. And I think when I first started painting, I barely used any pigments at all. It was just a red and a black and a yellow paint, and that was it.
And what were you painting when you first started?
People and hares.
Okay.
For some reason. And slowly colors started to creep in, but every time I'd introduce a color, it took me a very long time to figure out what I was going to do with it or how it fit in. So that green with Alistair in the background, and then through these bizarre COVID paintings and into this, yeah, it's always there. And I think I'm still trying to figure out how to use it. It's an emerald green. It's very, very alive, and it's very overwhelming. So you have to figure out ways to make it sit back.
Yeah, it's a very challenging color to play with. It's as challenging as too much yellow.
Yeah, green is an awful color to work with.
I think that's why so many artists are challenged by landscapes in Canada, because they're so green.
You're absolutely right. Every summer I fight with the mountains and I always lose. And I think that has a lot to do with it. I don't particularly like green as a color, so maybe this is just an arrogant display of not letting it win. I'm not sure. But that's a good observation. I never even really noticed that before, but it is everywhere somehow.
How long were you at the Alice Sanctuary?
One glorious day, and I got really sunburned. And that sunburn peeled for weeks, but it was worth it.
Well, you made a lot of friends while you
And we
were
brought
there.
fleas home,
Oh,
so that was a thing as well.
So that must have really been fun for your dog Bertram and your cats Stephen and Augustus.
They're usually suspicious when we've been hanging out with other animals, so it was a difficult difficult homecoming.
There you go. All right, let's look at this one. This is interesting. And again, it's a totally different technique, and you're using chalk in here. Do you want to talk about this in comparison to what we've been talking about? I see that you have some of your paintings on the wall, and this looks like your living room.
It is.
Yes.
It is. As my friend Alex would say, those are tiny paintings, and she absolutely loves them, and that's wonderful. Those are my friends Julie and Alex, and they're the most wonderful people in the world. But that was the only figurative pastel piece interior I've ever done. Every pastel, every time I've worked with pastel has been outdoors, and it's usually in the environment I'm living in. This was just an anomaly. I did it, and then that was it. I haven't gone back to it, but.
So approximately when would you have done this? Pre-animal, after animal?
That was about two years ago,
Okay.
maybe 3 years ago. It's pastel is just the most frustrating medium. It's so temporary. It falls off. Like this is already drifting down off of its off of the surface. It's just the strangest medium, and when it goes well, you're really, really pleased with yourself, and when it doesn't, it's just the worst, most humiliating experience. And this is one of the few pieces that I suppose, I mean, it's the only piece that that I would put out in public. So, yeah.
Okay, well, we have a tall portrait.
Right.
I'm going to focus on the background. So that must have been at the same time you were interested in fabrics?
It was a different fabric era.
Yeah, okay, a different fabric era, all right. So
I bought a bag of remarkable off-cut fabric pieces, and I just wanted to integrate them into paintings. It became the background for a number of paintings. But in this particular case, the fabric absolutely defeated me. I worked on this painting probably for a year, maybe a bit longer, and it's just, there's a narrative of the fabric makers back there involving these people in their idyllic fantasy world, and balancing that out against this figure so as not to command too much attention and create a somewhat harmonious relationship proved to be incredibly difficult. So I would work on it, scrape it down, paint over it, paint over again, scrape it down, work on it, back and forth. And to this day, I still look at it. It just makes me shudder. I don't think I would undertake that again. But it was a particular challenge, and perhaps there's like a part of me that likes to subject myself to punishment, but I certainly did in that case. And yeah, it was something. It was a weird project.
well, I've asked the question because of the intense detail that has gone on in the, the background of this fabric, which kind of leads us to your next style of working, which are the pointillist drawings that you've done. Talk about detail. And again, we have the bunnies and the hares are here. And this is just such a wonderful, wonderful series. What just made you decide to do pointillist? I mean, talk about detail, and if you want to go insane.
Yeah. So these are, Oliver and Stanley are these penguins that are exploring the world, but they don't want to be noticed, so they dress in these rabbit suits so they kind of can blend in and not be bothered as they go, and have their adventures. But I initially, when I started drawing Oliver and Stanley, I did them all with cross-hatching. And growing up, I watched a lot of PBS's Mystery, and Edward Gorey does the introductions to that, and it was the most marvelous thing in the world. And I've just had an affinity with cross-hatching ever since. But the trouble with it is it's the most unforgiving medium. So once you start working, if you decide you want to change something, it's probably too late. And if you make a mistake or your cat jumps in your arm while you're working, it's over and you just have to start again. So every single one of these was months and months of work, and probably a number of discarded identical copies that just had something went wrong. So I switched into pointillism because it was, of all things, more forgiving, because you can move things around a little bit more before you commit fully to the final picture, but it's still incredibly temperamental. So all of these they're just an absolute nightmare to make. I mean, that's just the absolute truth. And I think about them, and sometimes I don't sleep very well. And there's times I want those hours of my life back, but once you start, you can't really stop, and you got to see it through. So
did you do this as sort of one, one after the other, or did you do one and then take a break and go to something else and then go back to?
I can
Yes,
only do these when I'm feeling particularly brave.
Oh,
And I sometimes I just can't face it a lot of the time. So they work in the background of other things I'm working on. So if I'm feeling full of life, I'll try to tackle one and work on it for as long as I can. But yeah, I go through phases. And the last one I did was March last year, I think, and I haven't been able to face them since.
So just as an example, how long would something like this take you to do, or either one?
Well, I'll use this as an example.
Okay, great.
That one was probably all said and done 5 months. And it was pretty continual at times because the blacks, they're all dots and they all have to end up black. So you just find yourself, it's just a nightmare. I mean, you ask yourself why you even started, but yeah, I don't know. There's sometimes when you're done, you're glad you did it. And man, this is a strange medium, very challenging.
But I think these are such wonderful visual stories. You can let your imagination go with these animals and sort of wonder why and what and when and where, and just spend hours in them, probably as many hours as it took you to draw them.
Yeah, I ask myself, they always to me seem somewhat sinister. And I don't know if that's just a result of, as I've been working on them for days and months, I end up being really annoyed. So they reflect that. Or if it's a case of the reality of creatures being in a world that they're unfamiliar with and perhaps isn't very welcoming. And sometimes that feels like it's also present. But I think at the end of the day, I love doing these more than almost anything, but I just don't have the courage sometimes to undertake them. So when they do finally get finished, is usually a pretty big moment.
Well, they're lovely. They're absolutely fabulous. So, we have a question.
Good heavens.
Are you Oliver or Stanley?
I'm definitely Oliver. Oliver never talks, which I suppose is ironic because here I am speaking, but ideally I wouldn't be. So yeah, I'm an Oliver.
Okay. And then what is the reason for incorporating other still life objects with the animal portraits?
Because sometimes it just makes sense. That raccoon with his beaks, he needs them. I think we all need something, and at times you just realize that it just works. They need them, and I think it's as simple as that. And they have particular objects, and they're not random. It's whatever complements them best.
Great, thank you very much. All right, let's move over to these two. This is interesting. Correct me if I'm wrong. This is titled "Laughter He Still Has Not Learned Nor Beauty."
This guy.
This guy, yes.
Laughter he has not learned nor yet beauty, I believe. These were the first lockdown when it initially happened, and perhaps that feeling of being trapped and not being able to move anymore, you just want to dance. Everything became. It was a completely different medium. Well, it's not a different medium. It's oil and paper, and it's not something I'd really worked with before. But there was just a sense of containment and the feeling of wanting to escape. So everything started to get very closed in, and all of these kind of figures evolved out of abstract forms into kind of what you see here. And it was just a couple, maybe a month I worked on these. There was a whole number of them, and then I just stopped. And maybe summer started and you could go outside again, but it was very interesting to do. And they ended up in Harlequin clothes at one point, cavorting and leaping.
So we have a question here. Which would you prefer to paint, your animal friends or human portraits?
Human portraits.
Why is that?
Because they're almost impossible. Flesh is the strangest thing to try to make sense of. There's nothing to hang on to. It has no edges. it reflects light in the most bizarre way, and you're always defeated. I mean, maybe some people aren't defeated, and kudos to them, but I never, it breaks me trying to paint people. And it could be a function of being so familiar with them that your expectations of what something is blinds you to being able to actually see it honestly. And it's a very humiliating experience to paint people. But if you ever get close to capturing who you see someone as, that's as good as it gets. And that's all you can hope for.
Where does the penguin come from in Oliver and Stanley?
For some strange reason, I'm from the prairies. I've been obsessed with penguins my entire life. I think they're just the most noble creatures, and there's just so much dignity to them. And if I could be another animal, well, now I think I'd like to be a sparrow, but I really wanted to be a penguin for a large part of my life. And there's just something so inquisitive about them. And they've just, I'm not sure, but I love penguins and everything about them. So that they get to wander around the world in rabbit suits and explore on their own terms is just really nice.
That's wonderful. Back to this grouping of four, the top left, their vanity is charming, so long as it is never injured. Where do you come up with these wonderful titles?
I think I was reading a lot of Nietzsche at the time, and that confounded with the isolation, it just seemed right. I don't know. Those are the only things I've ever actually given a title to. Everything else is generally speaking just woman against blue background or man with shovel. But in this case, there seemed to be a narrative in play. And when I'd work on them, they'd end up with a title. And it was the only time that it ever really happened. So I don't think I can really answer that. But I do know that the title was part of how they came into being in a sense. And the hairs showed up again, which was, after you pointed that out, very strange. They're everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. I was noticing that the other day. Like, oh my gosh, there's 3 in that one, 2 in that one, but they're not dressed up.
No, they're definitely hairs penguinless, but I was, I mean, if you think back to last March and April, it was just so bizarre. Mm-hmm. And everything seemed very strange and ended up being very strange because of it, I think.
But one of the things we love about these drawings is that they're so fast and fluid, and you really grab the pose perfectly, and you get a really good sense of what these humans are doing. It's wonderful. Oh, the ones at the top, the dancers, I just love those. They're very lyrical, and makes one want to go to a circus or a ballet or something like that, something that we can't do now.
Yeah, I think we just all wanted to dance. And I certainly wanted to dance, and there it was. Maybe not in a form that was accessible to me, but yeah, it was a strange series because it happened over a month and then it never happened again. And it was working in a way I've never worked in before, and I've never worked in since. So I suspect they'll probably just live like that forever. It'll be a little anomaly, but I think oftentimes that's what happens is that what's going on forces you to choose different means of representation.
But again, like when we were talking about the animals and also I'll call them the spatula painting, you've done a really good job of picking up on personality and form and body language.
Oh, well, thank you. As I said, like the human form is the most daunting thing to undertake. It's so loaded with expectation, and we all know what we think people look like, so it's really hard to make them look honest. And I think more often than not, you fail, but sometimes they read a little bit more clearly. And yeah, the human form is really difficult, but yeah, I'll be dealing with that the same way I'll be dealing with lemons till the day I'm dead.
Well, I think it's fantastic that you're consistently challenging yourself to do things that you find so difficult.
Oh.
You know, a lot of people just say, well, that was that, done, moving on.
It was like a terrible like masochism or something, because I never enjoy it. Painting it's so impossible, and you always fail. And it's the most heartbreaking thing to deal with, is that when you finally give up on something, I never finish anything, you literally give up, you just realize what you could have done. And then you try to do that, and then you realize something else that you could have done, because you don't have a grasp on what it is you're trying to do. And that question is so elusive. And if I could ever answer it, I think I'd have a better chance of actually making sense of what I'm trying to make sense of. But I always feel like I'm really far behind the 8 ball, and there's a lot of self-pity and misery that comes with all of this.
So do you have or do you find it challenging to know when the painting is finished? Like when to say, okay, it's not because I'm done with it, but it looks complete.
I think that often comes about because I've committed myself to having them displayed, so they have to leave and I can't paint over them. But more often than not, and most of the paintings in this room are paintings painted over paintings, because they never work. And it's not that the reasons they don't work, if I knew why they didn't work, then it wouldn't be an issue, but I have no idea why they don't work, they just don't. And the ones that manage to escape out of the house to go into, to be seen by other people, well, there they are, and they freeze at that moment, and they'll be there, I suppose, unpainted over forever. But I don't know when to stop, and I suspect a lot of the time I pretty should have stopped earlier or perhaps later, but I'm trying to figure that out.
It's a challenge to know.
Yeah, it's a nightmare.
We have a question. All right. Your self-portraits are so accurate. Can you tell us more about those?
Narcissism. I'm absolutely obsessed with myself. I'm my own captive subject, and I'm my only reliable subject. So I painted more self-portraits than hares, and I painted a lot of hares. I paint myself all the time because I'm my only source of flesh and skin and other things, and I try to do it in as many varied forms as possible. And it gives me a greater understanding of the dignity you need to give other people in trying to give it to yourself. You're never more critical than you are of yourself, so you have to distance yourself from the overfamiliar face in the mirror and actually see yourself as you are, outside of your preconceived expectations. And that is a very difficult thing. And we're back into hares and lemons. I'll be doing that forever as well, because I can't wrap my head around it. But sometimes I feel the back of my head when I'm painting, and that's interesting.
All right, well, thank you. Is there anything else you want to discuss while we're here?
I think everyone should pick up a pencil, regardless of whether you have it in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years or whatever, and just use it as a tool to explore the world again, to pay attention to the things that you lose sight of so quickly. A pencil is absolutely a vehicle to paying attention to the things that matter. And the most mundane object in your house that you've overlooked time and time again becomes the most fascinating thing in the world. If you were to sit by yourself and stare at a teacup for 7 hours, you probably get locked up. If you have a pencil in your hand, it's entirely justified and should be. So I think everyone should draw, and it gives you an appreciation of seeing other drawings and figuring out how other people see. It gives us a sense that we all see things differently, and that's very valuable.
That's awesome. Thank you very much. Good advice. Put down the cell phone and pick up a pencil.
Pick up a pencil.
Very good. Before we sign out, Michael, thank you. This has been amazing. Your show is spectacular. Your work is fantastic. And we at the White are thoroughly enjoying having it here. Which is great. For our viewers, please explore Michael's work on our new web. And you can also see the work of Julia Hajnowski, and the site is explore.white.org. Thank you.
Thank you.